Good morning, good afternoon. I have the great pleasure to welcome you to the International Competition Network's workshop on competition, growth, and recovery. I would like to start by thanking our distinguished speakers who will join us during the coming 3 hours, and also ICN steering group members, and in particular its chair, Andreas Mundt, for the support in organizing this workshop. This is indeed a very special event to us, competition authorities, because our goal today is to reach beyond our very own network and discuss concerns such as economic recovery and inflation, which matter very much to all of us competition enforcers, and more importantly, also to policymakers. We are joined today in our discussions by about 500 people who share that concern wherever they are in the world. And so our responsibility towards them is high today, and the interest shown from many fields may also mean that we should have more of these interdisciplinary debates. So why are we highlighting today the correlation between competition, growth, and recovery? The stakes have been high for our policymakers in the past 2 years. Not only have they had to support economies and people throughout a very serious pandemic, they then had to help them jumpstart again through very uncertain scenarios. At the same time, significant supply-side bottlenecks emerged, labor shortages as well, inflation, and a war affecting many directly and indirectly across the world. So all of these have been added to the serious lists of constraints to our economies. Competition forces cannot obviously help solve all these troubles, but they discuss the role of competition policy in helping recover our economies in times of inflation. Our role can indeed be one of contributing to an informed decision by those who are designing and implementing policies that address such concerns. This workshop will discuss how competition principles can indeed foster a sustainable, resilient growth that benefits citizens. Because citizens, as consumers, as workers, as entrepreneurs, are really at the heart of competition policy. Competition matters to all of them. And a few examples can be competition matters in health because it allows for cheaper medicines and treatment. Competition matters to firms in obtaining cheaper funding from competing banks or other sources of funding. It matters to investors as well because it allows for better returns. Competition matters to workers because it allows for better salaries and more opportunities of having fulfilling jobs. It matters to all of us in obtaining cheaper and quicker communications. It matters in obtaining greener, more sustainable options, and in obtaining cheaper goods in food retail, and the list could go on. So competition delivers better outcomes in the markets to all of us, and especially to those who are the most vulnerable. And this is particularly important today as households are under so much pressure. So let me tell you that the competition community is very much aware of this link between competition and a robust and inclusive economic recovery. But such a link and its benefits can go very much unnoticed by those who do not deal with competition policy every day. Competition may not be the main medicine, of course, to treat the current afflictions in our economies, but as in the treatment of any serious illness, we need a cocktail of medicines, and competition principles may also be part of that solution. Now, alongside this workshop, this morning, the ICN published a statement of its steering group on the role of competition and competition policy in times of crisis. The purpose of the statement is to call on policymakers to support and maintain competition as they respond to the troubles we face. Many contemporary crises threaten our economic well-being, and during times like these, competition can become less of a priority. But as explained in the statement, history and experience tell us that it is important to keep competition front of mind in policymaking. Why is this? Because competitive markets are more flexible and more resilient. They respond faster and more effectively to economic disruptions. They protect the most vulnerable and they promote economic growth and innovation in the long run. This is why competition agencies are available to help domestic and international policymakers to look at issues through a competition lens. Competition agencies are also active in enforcing their powers, of course, and they do that by ensuring that markets do not get more concentrated in a way that compromises future choice for consumers. And this is done, as you may well know, through merger review. Competition agencies also ensure that firms do not form cartels to use, for example, inflation as a cover to raise prices. And they ensure that firms do not rig public tenders and thus do not lead to the misuse of scarce public budgets. As such, this statement is a contribution to the public debate and to policy efforts so as to ensure that competition is adequately considered by decision makers while pursuing broader economic recovery efforts. So I encourage you to use the ICN steering group statement as a starting point to other discussions that will certainly ensue over the following weeks. Now, what will feature in today's workshop? We have been very fortunate to gather an outstanding lineup of speakers with different institutional roles. The first panel, moderated by John Vickers, will address the interplay between competition and broader economic policy making. This panel will discuss how national and supranational institutions can integrate competition principles in their economic policies with the aim of promoting growth and a sustainable and resilient economic recovery. Then the second panel, moderated by Luis Cabral, will focus on the impact that competition can have in the current inflationary trend. These will surely be two very timely discussions, but just before that, we will have the privilege to listen to a keynote speech by Olivier Guersent. I hope you make the most out of this workshop, and I thank you for attending today our ICN workshop. Thank you.
Dear all, I am pleased and honored to participate in your workshop today, and I would like to thank warmly Margarida for a kind invitation. Prior engagements made it impossible for me to be in this call live, but I really did not want to miss the opportunity to share my views with you on an issue that is growing increasingly important and urgent. The issue is, of course, the role and impact of competition policy at this difficult juncture for Europe and for the rest of the world. The way you described it in the agenda you circulated for today's workshop is quite remarkable in one respect. It harbors no doubt that competition policy is among the public policies that can make a difference. And I totally agree with that position. There is indeed no doubt that competition policy can assist policymakers in other areas and support broader policy objectives. Only a few years ago, remarks like these would have been quite controversial, and quite a few commentators out there would maintain that it is not for competition enforcers to meddle with broader policy objectives. I don't agree. But of course I can see the point. Our credibility and our effectiveness depends on our independence from political pressure and interest groups. This is clear. But it doesn't mean that we should ignore the positive impact that competitive and contestable markets have on growth, on employment, and on innovation. And it is not only about boosting the economy. A level playing field is also what most of us intuitively associate with equality and fairness. And this applies to business people and consumers alike. Law-abiding businesses count on competition enforcers to give everyone the same opportunities to do business and succeed. And consumers count on us as well to make sure that companies don't plot to inflate prices or keep rivals at bay. All the more so in times when it is difficult to make ends meet. The debate about the proper remit of competition enforcers is not new, and it will stay with us for quite some time. But it seems to me that these difficult times have moved the terms of the debate. With crises of this magnitude, it is easier to see that we need a whole of government effort. All public policies should do their part, and competition policy should be no exception. I'm not saying that competition policy has pride of place, of course not. A number of other government policies are at the forefront. Public health during the pandemic, economy departments for Next Generation EU, defense after the 24th of February, and the departments in charge of Ukrainian refugees, and of course today, energy. At each turn, competition enforcers were striving to stay ahead of change by using all the flexibility in the rules to help pursue the policy objective dictated at each stage. One good example, in my view, is the stated temporary framework. The European Commission adopted back in March 2020, very shortly after the WHO declared the global pandemic, and it was necessary for the governments of the EU to prevent economic collapse. How large were the funds deployed? Well, by the end of 2021, EU countries granted around 940 billion euros of subsidies to companies in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. Around 2/3 of which in the form of state-backed credit. This was about 3.4% of their annual GDP of the EU 27. Many other countries around the world spent unprecedented amounts of public funds. But in Europe, we had an additional task. It was equally necessary for us to give a common and coordinated response to the pandemic. EU countries and the European Commission worked together to prevent a subsidy race because that would have undermined our EU single market. And protecting the single market is a core task for the European Commission and for the European Commission as enforcer of EU competition rules. A well-functioning single market is our single most precious asset. It's all the more precious as we try to boost recovery today in times of inflation. We monitored, together with EU countries, the support that member states granted under the state aid temporary framework. And our conclusions are encouraging. Their response was proportionate to the loss suffered. In addition, although the amounts were very, very large, they did not tilt the playing field, nor did they crowd out funding for other projects. We have published the complete findings very recently on 17 October in a state aid policy brief titled Looking Back at the State Aid COVID Temporary Framework. The temporary framework, introduced to face the economic impact of the COVID pandemic, was updated 6 times before it expired last June. And I hope dearly we will never need it again. But in March we had to introduce another temporary framework to coordinate the EU countries' support to their economies in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the energy and cost of living crisis. We updated the framework earlier this month, and let's hope this one too will become redundant very soon. I have made two main points so far, and I will use the words of Executive Vice President Vestager to recall them. First, I argued that competition is an instrument of efficiency. And second, that competition is an instrument of fairness. But now I would like to give you a few figures to make these points. Let me start with competition's power to make the economy more efficient. We are running an extensive project at the European Commission's Competition Department to try and answer two deceivingly simple questions. The first question is, what are the customer savings and other benefits generated by competition enforcement? And the second question is even more slippery. Can we estimate the costs of malfunctioning competition for society? In other words, what is the cost of non-competition? You will see why I call these questions deceivingly simple. They seem easy. They seem straightforward until you really look deep into them. And then you realize how difficult it is to get answers that we can be happy with. Our research has just started, so I can only give you early findings. For the first question, our experts say that competition enforcement in the EU produces direct customer savings in the range of 12 to 21 billion a year, depending on the precise assumptions made, or about 120 to 220 billion over 10 years. In addition, the macroeconomic benefits of our enforcement, as estimated by our colleagues in the Joint Research Center of the Commission, equals about 0.5 to 1% of the EU GDP. So that's not that bad. The first results of this project were published in a competition policy brief titled Customer Savings and Other Economic Benefits Generated by EU Competition Enforcement. And this brief appeared on 20 October, and I invite you to consult it. Now, let's turn to the second question, the slippery one. One can point to growing evidence that one of the effects of potential non-competition is higher concentration in many industries and higher profitability, in particular for the already most profitable firms. If you're looking for hard figures, past studies, mostly done in the US, put the cost of malfunctioning competition to between 0.5 and 8% of GDP. Well, this is a very wide range, of course, but these figures are potentially significant, and this means that we simply cannot be complacent. We are trying to produce our own figures, but we will have to wait a bit longer for those. I will now turn to the other point. Competition policy is also an instrument of fairness. And here, let me use the findings of a Eurobarometer survey that we commissioned earlier this year. We have asked citizens and small and medium-sized enterprises across the EU to share with us their perception of competition policy. We have published the findings of this survey today, and they are called SMEs' Expectations for an Effective Competition Policy and Citizens' Perception about Competition Policy, respectively. You can find them on Eurobarometer's website and via a link in the DG Competition's website, where you can also find the two other policy briefs that I have mentioned earlier. Let me draw your attention to two findings. First, the large proportion of people, around 80%, who believe that competition policy helps to keep prices down, stimulate innovation and economic growth, and give consumers more choices. That's quite big. Also, the proportion of SMEs responding that competition has a positive effect on innovation, on choice, on prices, that is even larger than 80%. In some, huge majorities seem to recognize the benefit of competition and of competition policy. Secondly, We have asked respondents to tell us where we, as competition enforcers, should have a stronger impact. And here the replies are surprising, because both citizens and SMEs told us that most of all, they want us to do better in preventing players from abusing their market power. The figure is the same for both and is very large, 87%. While the corresponding figure for the fight against cartel, very high as well, but is only 84%. And I was actually surprised that more people told us to fight harder against abuses than against cartels. Because cartels is the most intuitive breach of the rules. And I believe that what explains this surprising fact, is indeed the notion of fairness. Almost 9 respondents in 10 think that it is fundamentally unfair that a dominant company can operate in a market as if it owned that market. Abuses of dominance are not only bad for growth, bad for employment, bad for a number of things. They are also bad for the well-being of our societies because people think they are simply not right. If you are in Brussels in a couple of days' time, you can actually meet some of the colleagues who are behind the 3 sets of data I have used today. The figures on public support during the pandemic, or ongoing research on the benefits of competition and the cost of non-competition, and the Eurobarometer survey. These colleagues will set up poster presentations at a conference titled Making Markets Work for People that Executive Vice President Vestager will host in 2 days' time on Thursday, the 27th of October. And it seems to me that the conference and your workshop today move from a common assumption, and this is that the decisions of competition enforcers have a direct impact on the lives of ordinary citizens. We talk about markets all the time, and just as well, but we must never lose sight of the people who live and work in these markets. More important still, in these difficult times, we must never lose sight of the people who look for a job or find it increasingly hard to make a living in these markets. This is one of the issues that we will put on the table on Thursday. There are still seats, and of course remote connections are available, so if you have not registered yet, I would invite you to join you. Thank you very much and have a very productive day.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this first panel session, which is on competition and economic policymaking, building a resilient and inclusive recovery. I'm John Vickers, Oxford University. Many years ago, I was head of the Office of Fair Trading in the UK, and therefore was involved in the early years of the ICN. And I'm super grateful to Margarida and the organizers for inviting me to moderate this session, because I have very fond memories of those early conferences. I remember Naples, and then Merida, then Seoul, and then Bonn in the early years. And I'm wearing my special ICN tie today, which has the scales of justice on it, and was a gift from the Fair Trading Commission in Korea on the occasion of the Seoul conference. So I'm very pleased to be doing that. Now, we have a panel with 4 fantastic speakers. So without further delay, let me introduce the first of our speakers, that is Denise Egan, who after many years at the IMF is now at the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements. And what she will bring us is a macroeconomic perspective on competition questions. Until quite recently, competition and macro issues were seen very much in separate compartments, but I think both because of intellectual developments and very much because of events in the last 2 or 3 years, they are very much at one. So we're delighted to have you, Denise, and the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes or so. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this very distinguished panel today. Before I make my remarks, let me remind everyone of the usual disclaimer that these are my views and do not necessarily represent those of the BIS. So my interest and work on the topic of competition has been in the context of macroeconomic and macro-financial developments, being a macroeconomist myself rather than a competition expert. But as John said, it's an area that we cannot ignore as macroeconomists, as we learn with every crisis, that there are very intricate features that we need to include in our analysis in order to have a better understanding of the way our economies work. So in that context, I think a quick recap on what we know about the unintended consequences of certain recovery and support measures, as well as the link between competition and effectiveness of macroeconomic policies, may be helpful in setting the stage for a more in-depth discussion of the specific tools and cases and policies that my esteemed co-panelists would speak to with so much authority. So in my remarks, I will make and elaborate on 2 general observations. First, government interventions at times of crisis may entail unintended consequences, including competition distortions. And I will give you 3 examples that actually span over the past century. So to start with, one of the measures put in place to fight the Great Depression in the United States was the National Industrial Recovery Act. The effort here was to raise prices and wages in a deflationary environment. And the act aimed to do that by limiting competition and exempting an industry from antitrust prosecution if the industry accepted collective bargaining with labor unions. And soon after its passage, actually, the Supreme Court ruled the act was unconstitutional, but the Department of Justice continued to openly ignore collusive agreements in industries as long as that they paid high wages. And in their widely cited paper published in the Journal of Political Economy, Harold Qual and Leo Hennion showed that this resulted in cartelization and contributed to the failure of the economy to recover. Their calculations suggest that real output was still 25% below trend, even after a full decade after the 1929 crash. Now, let's fast forward 80 years, and the global financial crisis led to massive public interventions in financial institutions. as I am sure many in this audience will remember, these involved a range of tools and some very difficult decisions. With the stability of the financial system at stake and huge macro-financial spillovers involved, and the inadequacy of capital, the lack of capital being at the heart of the problem, bailing out these insolvent financial institutions was ultimately a necessary evil. And mistakes were made, and in most cases in the form of waiving the application of merger control rules. And our moderator, John, of course, has written about this in real time in the UK context, but more broadly as well. And sometimes mistakes were in the form of not having a clear exit strategy. And let me show you some evidence from our research on that. So I trust you'll be able to see my screen. So what we have done in our recent research was to take stock of interventions in 37 countries. And this spanned the period between 2007, the earliest intervention in the context of the global financial crisis, but up to 2017, so additional shocks that hit those countries as well. What we have done is through this period, through those 11 years, at a bank level, look into the public stake, either in the form of equity injections, hybrid measures that combine equity and loans, or loan guarantees, and track them through time, through those 11-year period, that can to see what happened to really those public stakes. Were they divested in a timely manner? And to many of you, again, it may not come as a surprise, but we do find evidence, we do show that even as late as 2017, there was still sizable public stake in these private institutions. And interesting suggestive evidence is when we look into the cases where divestment was faster versus divestment was slower, we do see some interesting regularities. Basically, slow divestment of government stake was associated with slower private investment and credit growth, as well as deterioration in financial access, in efficiency and competition, as measured by the Lerner index at the country level in the banking system. But of course, this does not mean that achieving macro-financial policy goals are necessarily in conflict with competition policy. And in subsequent research, what we wanted to do is explore in more depth and with more granular data what happens to the Lerner index, not at the country level, but what happens to it in the intervened banks versus their counterparts that didn't need those public interventions. And what we see in that case is that it was not an increase, but rather a decrease in bank markups if they were intervened, as shown in the vertical red line here. And looking deeper, this was driven by interventions in the form of direct equity injections rather than debt instruments. And it was also driven by a greater recognition of loan losses in intervened banks than a change in the pricing of their products. So these findings offer some hope that if carefully designed and executed, crisis-era interventions do not have to lead to competition distortions and associated consumer welfare losses. Now, of course, the crucial part of what I just said is carefully designed and executed. And as we all know, the incentive as well as the opportunity to use political influence to tweak support packages to a firm's or bank's favor are stronger at the time of a crisis. And our research on the global financial crisis-related programs provide evidence to this effect. More recently, we examined the allocation of resources in the context of COVID-19 related policy programs. And one interesting pattern that we have seen is that larger support has been provided to industries that have more concentrated lobbying activities, which could also be an indication of less competition within that industry. So more research in this area is needed, but obviously as more time passes, more and more researchers will be looking into any distorted impact of those massive packages that were put in place. Let me now turn to the second observation, which is despite profound changes in the economic landscape over the past few decades, structural reforms that would have boosted competition and innovation have been lagging even before the massive blows delivered by the pandemic and the war. Again, recent research, pioneers of which includes some of the speakers in the second panel of this workshop, has shown that corporate market power has risen in the recent decades. And while this is a quite broad-based pattern across countries and industries, the rise is particularly sharp in technology and in pharmaceutical industries. And if you look a bit closer, the rise is also concentrated among a small group of firms whose market power is becoming increasingly entrenched, the so-called superstars. And the surge of fast-paced digital economy, of course, is one of the drivers of this rising market power. Many new technologies, such as big data and artificial intelligence, seem to have favored incumbents and encouraged concentration. Although not the main driver, the escalation of mergers and acquisitions is also a contributor to the rising market power, however. And the number of deals worldwide soared in the early 2000s from about 20,000 a year to 70,000 right before the global financial crisis. And after a brief break during the crisis, a plateau, merger and acquisitions again started growing at a steady clip. And right before the pandemic, they were around 100,000 a year. More broadly, there is no hiding the fact that growth-enhancing structural reforms, including competition-related reforms, have not been prevalent in the 90s, since the 90s and the 2000s. You can see that in some recent research, and as highlighted in a speech by the BIS General Manager, Augustin Karsten's speech in Jackson Hole. These reforms slow significantly in many countries in advanced economies as well as in emerging market economies, even as our economies continue to evolve rapidly and new challenges to competition surfaced, as I just mentioned. And the way I think about it is, from the book, The Red Queen tells Alice, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. And if you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. So staying in the same place would mean falling behind. And to avoid this outcome, what we would need to do as policymakers is to co-evolve with the systems we interact with. And unfortunately, we have been perhaps falling behind a little bit. And the rising market power accompanied by this lagging structural reform agenda have had notable consequences from a macroeconomic perspective. Business dynamism has declined, and there are various ways to measure this. We can, for example, see it in the falling share of economic activity accounted for by young firms, as well as in lower disparities between different firms' growth rates, so they become more and more similar. And I would also tie this to the lackluster productivity growth that characterized much of the past few decades, again, alike in advanced economies and emerging market economies. In advanced economies, productivity growth plunged during the GFC and it never fully recovered. This is a part of a longer decline going back to at least the late 1990s. In emerging market economies, there's of course the catch-up potential and the productivity boost that came from integration into global networks and the structural reform drive of the 90s and early 2000s just proved to be fleeting, unfortunately. And the post-GFC slowdown in the case of emerging market economies has been the steepest and most prolonged of the past 3 decades. Importantly, from a macroeconomic policymaker's perspective, rising market power has also weakened the effectiveness of our traditional macroeconomic policies, monetary and fiscal policies. This is because firms become less sensitive to changes in the cost of inputs and in external financing conditions as their markups increase. And they would also be inclined to charge higher prices because they can, rather than increased output when demand for their goods and services increase as a result of stimulus. So missing the lift that robust productivity growth could have provided, economies had to rely on other sources of growth. And expanding financial systems provided an impetus, at least until the GFC. The engine of growth, fueled by debt and driven by demand, sputtered. And crucially, this was not neutral for potential growth. Scarring effects damaged productivity, as I just talked about. And as the recovery faltered after the Great Recession, fiscal and monetary policies were increasingly called upon to sustain output, even though they were gradually losing their potence. And although obscured at the time by still respectable growth rates and still low inflation, the constraints on the economy were becoming increasingly visible, even before the pandemic. And economies were becoming fragile, private and sovereign debt levels reached historical highs, inequality rose, and the room for policy maneuver was eroding because policymakers were forced to do ever more in order to bring the economies from where they had fallen. And then came the pandemic and the war. Sure, they are exceptional shocks and they are exogenous, but they painfully revealed the fragility of our economies and the need for solutions that go beyond short-term fixes, which would require promoting innovation and enhancing resilience, very much in the realm of what competition policy can do. So let me end with a few words on how to respond in the current environment, because we're facing yet another crisis, this time in the form of rapidly rising energy prices when inflation is already above target. In this environment, there's a premium on coherent fiscal and monetary policies. Targeted, tailored, temporary, and budget-neutral fiscal support could assist monetary policy in the anti-inflation fight. But it's crucial to minimize distortion of price signals, which may prompt rationing in the near term as energy demand would still stay high and hinder economic adjustment in the longer term, given competitive distortions. I thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Denise. Now, one of the great things in my view about that the ICN has achieved over its 20-year life is that it has become more comprehensively and more profoundly international. And what we have next is a perspective that in particular brings in the emerging markets, which have just been discussed, and developing economies. And to lead the discussion of that, we're very pleased indeed to have Ethiopia's Tafara, who is at the World Bank. In particular, he's a vice president and chief officer for risk and various other things at the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency within the World Bank Group. His earlier career was in financial regulation, including at the SEC, and then in private practice before that. Ethiopius, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, John. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. It's really a great pleasure to participate in this very distinguished panel of competition and economic policy making. As John has indicated, my name is Ethiopius Tafara. I'm the Vice President and Chief Risk, Legal, and Sustainability Officer at MIGA. And MIGA stands for the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which is one of the institutions within the World Bank Group. Of course, a resilient and inclusive recovery is at the heart of the World Bank Group's work, stemming from the twin goals of eradicating poverty and increasing shared prosperity. And in the past few years, we've additionally focused on a recovery that is green and sustainable. And given the current global context, restoring strong growth to the developing world is of paramount importance to achieving our goals. So in light of our mandate, I'd like to speak to you on the topic at hand from the vantage points of developing economies. And while developing economies appear to have the worst of the pandemic behind them, a recovery is not yet underway. Indeed, the crisis facing developing economies is intensifying, and what we see are reversals of hard-won progress rather than recovery. First, the tightening of financial conditions globally, slow growth, and currency depreciations are undermining countries' ability to recover. Second, during the pandemic, the balance sheets were hit by the need for extraordinary expenditures and the collapse of fiscal revenues. And now the situation is being made worse by soaring inflation, exacerbated by the global food, fertilizer, and fuel crises. And many developing countries are entirely cut off from access to capital markets or face far higher borrowing costs. In the current context, where there is limited room for the public sector to invest or to fall back on counter-cyclical policies, there's an ever greater need for the private sector to drive strong and inclusive growth in these countries. But the public sector has a key role to play in encouraging a vibrant private sector by working to attract private investment, fostering an enabling environment, and encouraging competition and a level playing field. Reforms that tackle underlying structural obstacles for growth and development are imperative. These reforms make possible the kind of competitive dynamics that foster a private sector, which can deliver access to essential goods and services, as well as consumer surpluses through price competition, create quality employment opportunities, and bring fair and transparent tax revenues to those governments. The reforms needed to create the right competitive dynamics stretch across a wide spectrum. However, broadly speaking, the focus should be on reducing government interventions that protect incumbents, aid collusion, or shelter less efficient firms. Of equal importance are reforms that advance anti-cartel programs and merger control, foster institutional effectiveness of competition authorities, and minimize the distortive effects of state aid support. In many of the developing countries where the World Bank Group has active programs, state-owned enterprises play a major role in the economy. These enterprises have mixed mandates, and their political importance can result in barriers to entry, and their dominance enables anti-competitive behavior, often with government protection or subsidies. Reforms can create space for the private sector. The private sector also benefits from transparent and competitive tender processes, including for public-private partnership arrangements alongside the need for expertise to design bankable projects. Fostering regulatory certainty and transparency, for example, for tariff setting, taxation, and royalty regimes is another critical element to enabling the private sector. I'd like to emphasize, however, that country context matters. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. Developing countries require carefully designed policies and reforms that are specific to the maturity of their markets and the particular sectoral barriers and country challenges. An enabling environment that opens opportunities for private capital and competition has to consider the country's specific political economy obstacles, the degree to which low institutional capacity is a constraint, and the need to address potential negative distributional outcomes. We have found that it's also important to build public support for reform programs. Competition reforms need to demonstrate that improved market contestability leads to concrete benefits for firms and households and contributes visibly to job creation and consumer welfare. This builds support for deeper and more holistic reform programs in the future. The World Bank Group, working with other partners, has a leading role to play in supporting reform efforts, enhance the development of the private sector. Our work combines advisory and financing of the public and private sectors, a powerful package for working with countries to foster private sector solutions that support development. Let me share an example of the World Bank Group's encouraging market creation and private sector investment. This example comes from Egypt and the renewable energy market, where the World Bank Group worked with the government to support the transformation of the energy sector into a sustainable and well-managed market that attracted private sector investment. Beginning in 2013, The World Bank advised the government on a reform package that resulted in an overhaul of the energy sector, including substantial subsidy reforms that were supported by policy lending from the World Bank. The reform package included the introduction of a solar energy feed-in tariff program. The aim was to attract private investment into a greenfield solar energy park, one of the largest in the world. The private sector arms of the World Bank Group, that is the International Finance Corporation, as well as MIGA, stepped in to work with authorities on developing bankable project finance documentation for the feed-in tariff program, alongside competitive tender and procurement processes. MIGA's political risk insurance and IFC's direct lending were able to crowd in private investors to support solar energy investments. And today, as a result of this work, the solar park is generating cost-effective solar-powered energy and creating thousands of local jobs. In addition, it's helping to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to removing about 400,000 cars from the road. This is just one example of how a well-designed sectoral reform strategy based on sound competitive principles and strong implementation can crowd in the private sector. In closing, I would stress that a well-designed competition regime can foster a resilient recovery and a race to the top of the development ladder. And there's a lot more to say in these areas, but I'll stop here so that we can hear from others and have a live discussion afterwards. With that, back to you, John. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ethiopis. Very good. So next, in the European Commission, there is a special unit, which is the Recovery and Resilience Task Force. And our next speaker, Reka Horvat, is deputy head of that unit. And I think will give us an outline of what its remit and task is, and then talk about some of the issues that it and we all are confronting. Reka.
Yes, many thanks, John, and hello, everyone. I don't know, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you are. So indeed, what I would like to talk to you about is a little bit coming from my practical experience. So I would like to explain to you how the European Recovery Instrument, which is the Recovery and Resilience Facility, incorporates competition principles in it. And so I have been working in this task force for 2 years, and I would like to give you some practical examples. But before I go to the examples, I think I need to give you a little bit of a background, and I promise to be very short on what is the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So this is Europe's recovery instrument after the COVID crisis. And the aim of it is basically to create a more resilient Europe that is ready for the green and digital transitions. And what is also important is that this recovery also needs to be sustainable. And the Recovery and Resilience Facility is a temporary instrument. This is in place until 2026. And basically, there was the agreement for member states to act jointly and to borrow money together and focus on a coordinated effort rather than individual funding in each EU country. And basically, the Recovery and Resilience Facility has just a little bit over 700 billion euros. And so far, already 113 billion has been disbursed, and the implementation is progressing at a very good speed. Now, what is important in this facility is that the money is not just given to member states, but there are certain conditions attached to it. And why is it so important? Because this can make all the difference of how impactful the spending of this money will be. And to benefit from this support, member states had to prepare so-called recovery and resilience plans, and they had to submit these to the European Commission. And these recovery and resilience plans had to comply with certain conditions. 2 of them were very, very easy, not to comply with, but to explain. So basically 20% of the spending had to go on digital investments, and 37% at the minimum had to go on climate investments. But what is very important for this talk is actually that the reforms and the investments that were proposed by the member states also had to address the so-called country-specific recommendations. I apologize because it is full of EU jargon, but I also need to explain to you what are the country-specific recommendations which are given within the European semester. European semester is a very EU thing. It is a mechanism that monitors and coordinates economic and social policy in the EU. This has been going on since 2011, and every year, the most important challenges of member states are identified, and then they are formulated as so-called country-specific recommendations. And what was one of the conditions of the Recovery and Resilience Facility is that in these recovery and resilience plans, member states had to address most of the country-specific recommendations of 2019 and 2020. And this is where the important reforms come in, which are very important for promoting competition in European countries. So I will come back to this reform element. And I think, Denise, you mentioned structural reforms. Ethiopis, you mentioned structural reforms. So these structural reforms that promote competition are super important here. But now I would like to take a step back and dive into how competition principles are integrated. So I will talk about the reforms a bit later, but the first and most important element here is state aid control. Ethiopis, you also put a very important emphasis on this one. It is very important that the money that is used for recovery does not distort competition. Here, we had a little bit of an easier task in the EU, because in the EU, any state support that is selectively given to enterprises and distorts competition is unlawful state aid, and it is prohibited. So basically, when the Recovery and Resilience Facility was created, it was decided that these state aid rules will equally apply for all the investments in the recovery and resilience plans, and that this will ensure that the recovery does not distort the level playing field. And how do we do this in practice? Basically, state aid is done by our distinguished colleagues in DG Competition, which you, via the ICN, know very well. So they are responsible for the state aid support, and they do not compromise. So we are helping in the Recovery and Resilience Task Force. We help member states to implement their plans, but it's DG Competition which does the state aid evaluation of all the measures. The thing what DG Competition did to help member states is they drew up some sector-specific documents which help member states to formulate their investments in the recovery and resilience plans in a way that makes them compliant with state aid rules, so that we don't get to the very strange situation that there is something in the recovery and resilience plan and then DG Competition says, no, it cannot be implemented. So state aid, super important. And this is the most important element, which also ensures that private investment is not crowded out, because state support only flows to where it does not distort competition. So this is where we are with state aid. And then now I would like to talk about the important structural reforms. So we are back to the country-specific recommendations. Many member states, sorry, we also call EU countries, call them member states. So many EU countries had country-specific recommendations that related to the business environment. So make business environment more business-friendly, and that also includes competition. Sometimes there was even direct reference to competition, make certain sectors more competitive. And therefore, when member states needed to address these country-specific recommendations, they had to include structural reforms that further competition. Now, probably the most prominent and the most obvious of these reforms is a reform in the Italian Recovery and Resilience Plan, which is actually a competition reform. So here, what happens is the Italian Competition Authority, and I'm sure that in the audience we have colleagues from there, so they have been for years formulating every year certain recommendations to the government for the government to act upon it. But until now, it was at the discretion of the government whether these recommendations will be implemented or not. Now, in the Italian Recovery and Resilience Plan, there now is the commitment that the Italian authorities or the Italian government will need to implement the recommendations of the Italian Competition Authority. So this is obviously, and these recommendations relate to, for example, introduce structural separation in a certain sector, stop regulated pricing somewhere else. I'm just, giving examples from the top of my head. But whatever the competition authority finds important in order to preserve a level playing field or create a level playing field in certain markets will need to be implemented. Now, some other reforms, and Ethiopia also mentioned this, and this is very important. Some other structural reforms relate to public procurement. Again, we have a little bit of an easier task here in the EU because there is a directive which mandates that public procurement should comply with certain criteria. But obviously, there are other things that form part of public procurement or how the process works, and these ones can always be improved upon. So, for example, again, I think Italy, if I remember correctly, hopefully in Spain and in some other EU countries where existed such country-specific recommendations that related to public procurement, and these member states included reforms to address this. So these are typically reforms that make public procurement faster, that you need to submit fewer documents, that cuts the deadlines in the process, and so on and so on. Obviously, we all know that if public procurement is easier, that brings down the barriers of entry, and therefore it's easier for new entrants and for anyone to compete for certain contracts. Then, in the same vein, we also had country-specific recommendations relating to licensing. These are, again, typically make licensing easier, one way or another. And for example, in Portugal, in Greece, if I remember correctly, we have reforms of the licensing system that, again, directly brings down barriers to entry and makes markets more competitive. And finally, I would like to come to my personal favorite reform, which is, so some countries had country-specific recommendations relating to highly regulated professions. And so, for example, in the Portuguese plan this is my favorite first because I am responsible for the technical work on the Portuguese Recovery and Resilience Plan. And second, I wanted to mention this reform because it is actually a reform. So, highly regulated professions, lawyers, architects, and so on and so on. So the Portuguese Recovery and Resilience Plan has a reform which will liberalize at least some aspects of these professions. And why it is so interesting? Because it was the Portuguese Competition Authority, so our hosts, who years before this crisis drew up a list of recommendations for the Portuguese government how highly regulated professions should be liberalized. And Portugal included a reform which commits to address these recommendations in the Recovery and Resilience Plan. So that is also something very interesting. And I think I stop here so that we will have time for discussion. But you can see that the Recovery and Resilience Facility indeed promotes even directly competition in markets. Thank you very much. And back to you, John.
Thank you, Reka. Wonderful. Now, our final speaker before we come to the discussion is Stéphanie Yoncotin, who is a member of the European Parliament, which she has been since 2019. But before that, had deep experience of the world of competition law and policy, both in private practice and, among other things, as an advisor to the French Competition Authority some years ago. So we have a competition expert parliamentarian, which is fantastic. And we look forward, Stephanie, to hearing your remarks on competition policy and recovery and its links to industrial policy. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you to Margarida and all the ICN organizers, and I'm very happy to participate in this webinar. It reminds me of my former life as advisor for international affairs to the former chair of the French Competition Authority, Bruno Lasserre. It's always a pleasure to speak at the ICN, and I really do hope we could use this forum of discussion more often, as I think we can see from the interventions from the other distinguished speakers that the competition policy is definitely key and part of all policies. So after the pandemic, looking at Europe after the pandemic, and now with the Russian invasion to Ukraine, we are now discussing, and we've heard that from the other speakers, concept as strategic autonomy, resilience of our economy, industrial competitiveness. All of these are now clear objectives of the EU, and it becomes clear that competition policy will play a big role in achieving this milestone. And I'd like to come back on the crisis that we were going through with the pandemic, and I hope that we have learned some lessons. I'm not sure we have learned them all. And we are now going through another crisis with the Russian invasion to Ukraine. So we definitely have to take stock of what we've done so far. The COVID has highlighted the EU's long existing structural problems related to the supply of medicines and the dependency on third country import for certain essential and critical goods and materials. And in the wake of the pandemic, it is as if we finally found out that we were dependent on third countries, such as China or India. And one of the key lessons of the crisis is that there is a need to get a better grip and understanding of where Europe's current and possible future strategic dependencies lie. Now, with the Russian invasion to Ukraine, we had no choice to face our dependency to Russian gas with no immediate alternative option. The EU had recognized its strategic dependence on some foreign inputs even before the pandemic, and we have started to seek ways to increase our autonomy. So to improve the resilience of supply chains, we are applying a policy mix that aims to increase domestic capacity, diversify suppliers, and support. We understood that we should remain united in times of crisis and that we are stronger together. Competition is, I think, again, key to ensure the integrity of our single market. And I will just name 3 examples because I think time is running and I don't want to take so many time, but I think the single market emergency instrument, the SMEI, will make it easier for the Commission to organize the public procurement of crisis-relevant goods on the European level so that national governments do not push the prices up in an attempt to outbid each other. Also, during the COVID crisis, the member state to help households and companies while avoiding unfair competition between member states. And also the energy crisis raised the same questions with the division between member states that do not want to cap gas prices, but can afford to put billions on the table to help its own economy. I think we should keep our united approach with the joint purchases, for instance, in line also with the recovery plan based on common debt to ensure the same conditions for everyone. So I think we need to work also on a better interplay between competition policy and the achievements of our European objective that we have democratically set for ourselves. I think this is important. We have finalized our regulation of the digital giants, but the question that already arises is how we are going to create European champions in innovative technologies where Europe still has its card to play. Also, the review of merger control, even if still taboo, seems to be quite a necessity if we want to fight effectively against killer acquisitions. And we should also think in terms of efficiency gains linked to a merger in order to address the challenges of industrial competitiveness in the European Union. I also wanted to mention very briefly the potential in using public procurement to increase resilience, because I think, and I called in July last year for a Buy European Tech Act to ensure a fair share of European public purchases from innovative European companies, SME and startups. Following the Europe Defense Fund, I think it's time for the European Commission to become truly aware of the need to buy in Europe and to publish a legislative proposal in this sense. And to conclude, I'd like to remind all of us that whatever we put on the table, if we do not have the right resources to implement it, it will only be an empty shell. We agreed in such a short time for the EU on landmark regulations such as the Digital Markets Act, the Foreign Subsidies Regulation, or the anti-coercion instrument. However, if we do not have the adequate resources in terms of volume and competencies, then we won't have anything. And we will not only fail at achieving our own objectives, we will also put us at risk. So I think it's very important that the EU strategy and the level playing field are very important. And if we don't have the means to implement the landmark decisions, again, everything will remain a dead letter. And I think, well, what matters the most is to do. I just, at the end, would like to quote Jean Monnet, who used to say, everybody is ambitious. The question is whether he is ambitious to be or whether he is ambitious to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Now, we have 20 minutes or so for discussion until this session ends at 15 minutes past the hour. We don't have the technological ability to take questions from the audience. Apologies for that. So it's going to be a discussion within the group. And in a moment, I'd like to give each speaker in the order we had to see if they would like to make further comments in light of what other panelists have made. But before that, let me say a couple of things and pose a sort of deliberately provocative framing question. I should also say to panelists, if you want to come in sort of out of order or make an extra point, put your actual hand up. And if I notice you in the little boxes on my screen, I will try and bring you in. So 2 comments. First of all, what do we mean by competition policy? I think that Reka helpfully reminded us that it's not just antitrust, law on anti-competitive agreements, cartels, etc., and on abuse of dominance, plus merger policy, plus state aid. Competition policy more generally relates to the fact that government interventions can do all sorts of good or ill for competition and competitive forces, and existing or new regulations can work well or badly from that point of view. And I think we do need to think more broadly. Second point before my provocative statement is, we've had in the last 20 years 2 very big crises. We had the so-called global, really North Atlantic financial crisis, though it had its global impacts, which was sort of the peak of that was 2008, but the after effects went on for a number of years. And here in Europe, we had the Eurozone crisis, which certainly ran through 2010, 11, 12. And then more recently, we had the COVID crisis, which itself has had various aftershocks, most obviously, or consequent events, most obviously the Russian invasion. But even before that, there were many, many issues coming out of the pandemic, arguably the maintenance of ultra-loose monetary policy for far too long by the world's central banks. But of course, we have a panel coming up on inflation. But we're really still suffering these shocks. And these 2 crises seem to me very, very different in nature. One, massive hit to the financial system, but for the rest of the economy, it was a demand shock, not a supply shock, at least to a first order approximation. A car factory could produce cars just the same, a restaurant could serve meals just the same. Whereas the COVID shock was totally different, a massive supply shock. We had incredible shortages, we had relative prices going all over the place, creating all sorts of political and social as well as economic issues. So my provocative statement, which I do not believe for a moment, but let me articulate the one sometimes here, is look, competition policy is all very well in normal times. Yes, we get it, makes perfect sense. But crises and emerging out of them, recovering from, it's just different. You just have to dial certain things down, switch them off, then fine, when everything normalizes, we can bring back normal competition policy into play. And I think quite a lot of the points you were making are contrary to that view, and it's 180 degrees opposite to my own view. But let me put it out there as a sort of thing to, as a framing thing perhaps for you to challenge. I won't say any more now, but let me invite, if you'd like to, Denise, would you like to go first in this first sort of tour of the panel on comments on what we have so far heard?
Sure, thank you, John, and thanks to everyone for really stimulating and very informative points that were raised. I agree with almost all of them, perhaps all of them. I want to come to the question of, is crisis the right time to tinker about competition policy? And I would say, well, definitely, because most of the structural policies actually do happen around crisis. And as things get normal, generally speaking, we do see a willingness to kind of start pushing the can down the road again. So it's the urgency of the situation that actually we do get to do the things that were necessary in hindsight. And the other observation I would make there is often the things, the structures we put in place, knowing or not, we realize their bigger, broader consequences, and they become pet dependent. We can see that, for example, I guess one of the most prominent examples is how mortgage markets are structured around the world. And when we try to explain what are the factors that's determining those, is generally a history of crisis, what they have gone through, and how they reacted to that, and the pet dependency that explains most of the differences more than any other economic or social factors that we can come up with. So it's history in one sense. But I don't want to take most time, but I would truly emphasize that if anything, is the opposite. Crisis is the time to make sure that we're doing competition correctly.
Don't waste a good crisis. Thank you. Ethiopis, would you like to go next?
Sure, John, and I'm actually going to double down on your provocation. I did not give a disclaimer at the beginning, and what I say does not necessarily represent an institutional view. But in my experience as a development professional, and I'm not a trained economist, but what I have witnessed frequently in certain emerging markets at certain times, the best thing they can do is put in place what in essence amounts to a monopoly. There are state-owned banks, for example, that exist in a number of markets where the banking services are either non-existent or very, very small. And the state-owned bank is put in place actually because there is no alternative. And of course, once those banks have been around for a while and they establish themselves, displacing them can become challenging. But in some respects, sometimes I think when it is you step in to actually promote, in this case, greater competition or greater regulation is really a matter of timing. I'm reminded, I, as you said at the very beginning, was a regulator in the United States for a very long time, and conscious of the fact that, the New York Stock Exchange came into existence in the late 1700s, and the SEC didn't come into being until 1934. And I always wondered the degree to which the market would have grown in the way that it had, if there had been an SEC much, much earlier. So I wonder sometimes whether or not when you step in as a matter of timing, yes, don't waste a good crises, but are there other instances or other times where you say maybe now is not the time, because I actually may end up pushing against what's needed in terms of services by virtue of insisting on on a certain regime, and maybe what we need for the short period of time is some sort of monopoly, anti-competitive situation before moving to something else. Anyway, I'm doubling down on your provocation. I'm not suggesting I believe this wholeheartedly, although I do think there are instances where maybe it's something to consider.
Thank you. And you remind me, I think the Fed didn't come into being until
early 1920s, I think 1920s or so, yeah, something like that.
I think the crisis of 1907.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think J.P. Morgan personally sorted it out. Okay, well, very provocative of you. Let us go to Reka next.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you, Ethiopis. So obviously, I mean, my experience is with developed economies, and here what John said is absolutely not true. I mean, we have data actually that this is not the case, that relaxing, competition enforcement, so either merger control or antitrust control is not a good idea during crisis, because it actually, then the crisis lasts longer. So obviously we all know this, and the ODS also knows this, because we are competition professionals. But what I also wanted to say is that actually it's, in a way, we should look at crisis as new beginnings. And because we can reset the economy, we can create new habits. So I think that even in those jurisdictions where competition policy is not so developed yet, a crisis can actually give a new beginning, where you reset everything and then you put rules in place which will then flourish and will regulate the economy to the right direction. And every crisis is an opportunity to do things even better. Of course, I am not proposing that now after the war, we will need yet another crisis to do things even better, but nevertheless, crisis can be opportunities as well.
Thank you very much. I should say at this point that Stéphanie Yoncotin had to leave at the hour for another appointment. So we thank her very much indeed for her contribution, but she can't, because she has left the call, cannot be part of this discussion. Let me pick up a point that Olivier Guersent raised in his comments and see what your reactions are to this. And it's partly about the public attitude towards market forces. So Olivier talked about unfairness. And I think where you have a firm that has a lot of market power, and in the crisis, it raises its prices and its margins even more, there's some self-evident way that resonates with us all that is unfair. But one thing that struck me at times in the pandemic was that there were sometimes cases where the prices of what I'll call resilience goods and services shot up simply because of supply and demand, not because of anybody exercising market power. It's just the supply curve and the demand curve moved, so the price went up. You could even see that with what's happened with food and energy prices, which incidentally were already rising before the Russian invasion, but clearly have in much of the world gone up further since. So even where it's just normal supply and demand economics, I think there can be a very strong, almost public repugnance towards such price movements and the profit consequences for some suppliers. And I wonder what that means for the market provision of resilience goods and how market forces can work in a recovery. If markets working in a normal, say, textbook way is seen as unacceptable, then we might be in quite a mess in terms of how market forces can help us out of some of these messes. Or is that just a silly worry to have? Should we try the same order as before, but no obligation to comment. But if you did wish to, Denise, please come in now.
This is, I think, is a quite thought-provoking idea that I have given some thought, but I don't really have a good answer to. I think I would dissect it into two. Like with the monetary policy maker hat, when you see relative price changes, as John, you talked about it early on, and you think that they are necessary for the economy to adjust, you need to find a way to accommodate them. Right? So with that textbook head on, I'm thinking there is more costs than benefits into trying to stop what needs to actually happen. At the same time, we talked about crisis being an opportunity or not, or even in normal times, having public support in order to put in place the type of reforms that we need. When with that head on, if we need that public support and in democratic societies with accountability and transparency, yes, we do need it. Then that fairness calculation needs to get in as well. So with my relatively uneducated macroeconomic perspective, I'm trying to cut it both ways, I'm guessing, but finding ways to be able to accommodate fairness. And maybe one specific observation there would be part of the unfairness observations also goes to pre-crisis conditions, right? And making sure that our tax codes are also fair and growth friendly, and having social safety nets in place, and having systems that can respond quickly to structural changes and challenges, and understanding that, again, in the textbook, we have the monolith, homogeneous agent, representative agent responding to everything, but that's not the real world, and making sure that we are actually relying much more on the efforts to understand heterogeneities across households, across firms, and devising policies that could actually understand that richness and respond to that richness is the way I would put it.
Thank you. So, I mean, a classic case right now, and this is not any policy prescription, but just look at, say, retail energy prices. Should the authorities try and hold them down? Might that mean rationing? Might that go against green agendas? Or should you just say, well, the market price is the market price, and we'll do targeted income support for low-income households? I think that would be a very sort of sharp example of this kind of dilemma. Ethiopis, was anything on this, or indeed any related, closely, distantly related theme? If you'd like to add any comments, please do now.
I don't think I have much to add on this, except that, what you've highlighted is the importance of us being very nuanced about what we say with respect to government intervention, because there are instances, and we're seeing this throughout the developing world, where the government is stepping in to subsidize goods and services, goods primarily by virtue of what's happening to their prices. And we've each spoken in our opening statements about needing to limit government intervention, but this just goes to show that there really needs to be nuance in how we think about government intervention, because there are many a time when it's going to be a necessary part of fairness, right? But that's all I would have to add, John. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rika.
Yeah, I actually have quite a strong view on this. So we know that competition policy on the long run protects everyone and creates a level playing field, and it also brings a sense of fairness for everyone, right? We even know that for example, in the European competition law, even if prices on the long run are very high, then there is a possibility to intervene there. However, it does not mean that if temporarily there is a price increase, then we have to use competition policy to do anything about that, right? Because this is not the right instrument. But indeed, whenever such a situation arises, and this is what the European Union decided to do also, for example, with the high prices, high energy prices, that the most vulnerable need to be protected from this. And this is basically, there are fundamental rights of to warm your houses, to eat, to drink, and these need to be respected. And I think then in that case, there is absolutely a reason for state intervention, but this has nothing to do with competition policy, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it does strike me we're at a time of very extreme relative price movements, particularly food and energy, and the distributional implications of that seems to be potentially very severe indeed. Also, for many economies, the adverse terms of trade shift. I mean, your GDP might be the same this year as last year, but the amount I can buy with my GDP could be very much less because things I import big time have had enormous relative price increases. So I think that that is part of the difficulty we face. I've one last, we've only got 3-4 minutes left. I didn't want to leave on the table the remark that Stephanie Yoncotin made about the aims of competition policy, where she said something about maybe we shouldn't be quite so consumer focused as traditionally. And of course, there are debates about antitrust globally and in the US. And I know what I think about that, but I'll keep quiet and ask others whether they have comments on that. Reka, would you like to go, well, let's do reverse order. Would you like to go first with any thoughts on that point?
So you are asking the goals of competition policy apart from...
Yes, I mean, I think Stephanie said something, I mean, it was carefully moderated and so on, but whether the sort of consumer litmus test that has been applied, it's more complex, but both in the merger area and in some other branches of competition or consumer benefit test, do we need to rethink that, or does that remain the correct approach?
This is indeed very provocative. And this is what I'm saying is entirely my own views, not the European Commission and not our esteemed colleagues in DG Competition. So, I mean, I'm a UK trained competition economist. So my view would be that there is competition policy and there is industrial policy, and each serves their own purpose, and these should not be mixed up. But obviously, there are certain flexibilities within competition policy that can be used, but the boundaries should not be stretched too much so that it is no longer competition policy. But these are my personal views.
Thank you very much. Ethiopius.
I'm not a UK trained economist, but I agree with Reka.
Denise.
I also agree with Reka. Maybe just one small thing to add there is the international dimension to that, right? For better or worse, the past 50, 60, 70 years, the international cooperation we achieved did help a lot of countries, right? And we shouldn't throw the baby with the bathwater. That's all I like to say.
Very good. So I would join with the purism that Reka has articulated. But I think we've got sort of unanimity on the panel. I'm not sure that would prevail in all groups, however. Right, it is very nearly 15 minutes past the hour. So the organizers, who are very strict, have asked me to remind everyone that at 1/2 the second panel will begin. So there's a short break now, but please be back at your screens for the 1/2-hour commencement of panel 2. Finally, enormous thanks to all of you on this panel, and to Stephanie, who, as I say, had a prior commitment, so had to go a bit earlier. But I thank her and Denise and Ethiopius and Reka very much indeed for what I think has been a very stimulating discussion. Thanks very much. Bye.
Well, welcome all to the second panel of today's ICN conference. This second panel will be focused on competition in times of inflation. My name is Luis Cabral. I am the Paganini Gould Professor of Economics at NYU Stern School of Business, and I will be the panel's moderator. And I am very pleased to announce a most distinguished panel that includes Christina Kafar, Head of Keystone Europe, Jan Eckhout, Professor of Economics at Pompeu Faber, and Klaus Masuch, who's a Principal Advisor at European Central Bank. Now, I see my role here as the moderator as primarily introducing the speakers and then just getting out of the way. And our plan is to have a first round with remarks by each of the speakers, about 15 minutes each. And I will introduce each speaker before their first set of remarks. And so with no further ado, let me begin by introducing you Christina Kafar. So Dr. Christina Kafar, she's the leading competition economist, and she has, as I mentioned earlier, the European practice of Keystone. Prior to that, she spent 15 years as head of competition at CRA, European competition at CRA. And in that context, she worked on quite a variety of landmark mergers and antitrust matters for decades, really. And she's, you can even say, a living legend and considered an important contributor in particular to the current discussion on regulation of the digital economy. And she's been quite a number of keynotes and roundtable events. And I think it's a sign of how much on demand she is that she's on two panels today, which unfortunately overlap, which means that she will not be able to stay with us until the end. But some time is better than no time. And we're very grateful that she's here with us. Dr. Kafar holds a PhD in economics from Oxford University and is an honorary professor at University College London, as well as the deputy director of the CEPR Competition Research Policy Network. On a personal note, I should say that I frequently agree with Christina. I sometimes disagree, but even then, I think we agree to disagree, which I think is important, and more than can be said for many of the current debates. And I, as many others, have greatly benefited from her experience and knowledge, as well as from what she's added to the current discussion, especially on competition policy matters in the digital world. So with that, I conclude my introduction, and I very much look forward to what you have to say, Christina. The floor is yours.
Wow, Luis, I mean, I'm choked. I mean, this is such a nice introduction. Thank you so much. And thank to the organizers for, of course, thinking of me. It is a privilege to be part of this day, this event, and indeed a particular privilege to be part of this panel. As Luis indicated, my background is really as a competition practitioner. I've been a competition economist for 100 years, and so I have been involved in a lot of this discussion. The topic of the panel here today is of particular interest because it has raised a great deal of interest globally. And of course, while I'm not a macroeconomist or someone who can claim any expertise in the study of growth and economic macroeconomy, the intersection with competition enforcement has become very live in the last few months. And so there's been a great deal of debate in the current circumstances about the role in particular that market power, which is the focus of what competition enforcement really is, the role that market power plays or has played, is playing currently in inflation, in particular the extent to which inflation is being somewhat exacerbated right now by market power. And therefore, whether amongst what one may kind of describe as the difficulties that antitrust is facing, there's also the problem that failure to control market power is a contributing factor in amplifying inflation, and therefore should we be more interventionist than before. So there's been a real bum fight around this question on social media over the last few months, because there were some economists saying, no, this has nothing to do with market power. Inflation is orthogonal to market power on many dimensions. And others, particularly on the progressive side, that were saying, how can you say that? Are you hearing what CEOs are saying on earnings calls? There is a great discussion about how ultimately they are taking advantage of the high-rise price environment to also put through price increases. So we ran a seminar on this and the CEPR in July. Professor Eckhout was one of the speakers, and there was a great combination, a great group of macroeconomists, people working on IO, but taking into account macro views and vice versa. And really, I'm not going to somewhat replicate that discussion, but I found it extremely rich from the perspective of someone who is steep into the enforcement of competition. It was a great table setting, a great set of insights. And I want to start the discussion today, but perhaps giving to the group of people listening who are probably more likely to be competition experts and macro experts, a sense for what maybe some of the key takeaways for me were from that discussion. And then, of course, I leave it to Jan and to Klaus and to Luis to amplify all of this with greater expertise than I possibly can. So as a starting point, I think the consensus, which is not surprising, from that broad and well-informed discussion was that it is pretty crazy to claim that market power is the main culprit of inflation. It would be a crazy claim, although there are some dimensions in which it could be a concause. The question is how important and what is the direction of causality to some extent. Of course, when you think about the causes of inflation, I don't need to lecture anyone, but there's been an embarrassment of choice here. There's been a perfect storm of major supply side events. We've had the pandemic, we've had the various supply chain disruptions, and we've had an oil shock. And then on the demand side, of course, we had a massive demand side stimulus. A lot of money was pumped, particularly in the US economy, transferred to families, big pulse of monetary growth there during the COVID recession, which is hard to think wasn't going to have some effect on price levels. So when it comes to thinking about this, I'm certainly not the expert, but what I clearly took away was that the consensus was there was no sense in which market power and concentration were a major cause for what we were observing, inflation accelerating in spite. That said, the next question really is more pertinent, which was, well, okay, it isn't the major cause, but as market power, as it is in the economy, been in some way responsible for accelerating the price trajectory, for accelerating price increases that we see? Are there indicators that this acceleration in inflation is linked in any way with market power? This is a territory that Jan occupies very centrally with all the work he's done on margins and concentration. So I will not exhaust the subject in any shape or form, and I leave it to him to discuss this. But there's been some studies kind of motivating these claims. There was a Roosevelt Institute paper that essentially claimed that looking at margins, there was a big increase in 2021 at the same time as inflation was taking off. And there was also a notion, a paper by the Boston Fed and others in the Twitter exchange that somehow margins have increased particularly sharply in sectors with more concentration, where therefore there is more market. So again, Jan will tackle this directly, but my understanding was that both of these claims are a bit dubious, and the jury is still very much out. My sense was that Jan wasn't particularly convinced. Certainly the notion that margins increased sharply in 2021 is both questionable factually because of data issue, but also what do we make of that? There can be lots of reasons why margins have increased, and the causation between that and inflation is unclear. Also, at a basic level, there is a difference between inflation, which is about the level of prices. This is a point that Jan made very eloquently, I think, and margins, which is a notion of a relative measure. So even though you can identify a relationship between the two, because if the rate of growth of margins is high, then it will find its way into the rate of growth of prices. They are not the same. And so again, one of the things I took away was the big difference that exists in terms of time horizon, in terms of order of magnitude and uncertainty in these different sort of measures. So, inflation is sharp, it goes up quick. market power is is on a slower trajectory. And it is, of course, affected by a multiplicity of factors. So these factors tend to be much slower moving than a sharp increase in prices. Then there is magnitude. Again, Jan will talk about this. But when we're looking at inflation effect of 2, 3, 4, 9%, you're not really talking about the same size of the increase in market power. Measured by margins. Again, this is very much Jan's territory, but there is an order of magnitude difference. And there is also great uncertainty. That means at the present time, entrants are uncertain even more than usual about reading the price signal and coming into a market and taking away profits, because of course everything is upside down. So this idea that inflation has been materially accelerated that by market power is something on which my takeaway was there is considerable skepticism by those like Jan who have looked at this in great detail. And then the final set of claims that had sought to establish a relationship between market power and inflation was the notion that pricing has been rising actually faster in more concentrated sector. And so again, this was not, this is something which I've seen sort of mentioned as a claim in a Boston Fed paper. Others on Twitter have kind of improvised various kind of comparisons of data, CompuStat versus concentration in different sectors. And that discussion is also relevant because, again, it is another way of thinking, does market matter in this discussion on inflation? And of course, the classic expectation is that of the pass-through of costs into prices is the other way around, that you pass cost increases through into prices, less if you are a more concentrated, a firm with more market power. And the reason is simply you have more slack in the margin to effectively slow down that price increase. And this is a standard intuition. Anyone who does in competition damages assessment knows that the pass-through of cost is assumed to be smaller in markets where there is more market power. So there is nothing particularly actually the way in which we tend to think about this is the other way around, that indeed where you have more market power, there is less pass-through. And this is also empirically validated. I think there was a recent paper by the ECB that I've seen mentioned, it was mentioned in that discussion, that also sort of supported this. All of this is kind of saying, okay, so it is interesting. We are concerned about market power increases, but the relationship between market power increases and inflation is complex, is not easy to establish, and is certainly not a major driver. Then I thought was very interesting what, and to conclude on that event, what Thomas Philippon said, because his point was, yes, you know, we have standard intuitions about what is the relationship between concentration and pass-through, but in some sense we're asking a little bit about the wrong question here. We're not asking ourselves if there is a 1% increase in cost, how will that get through into prices? The question is more, when we are in a world in which the structure of the economy may have changed because there is more concentration, does that do what to the way in which prices behave? And his final point, which I liked, and I want to use this as a jumping off point to my final remarks on competition, his final point was, we need to think about the opportunity here. In terms of the opportunity, yes, it is not the case that inflation is majorly driven by market power and concentration. And we know that intervention in market power in enforcement is a one-off that cannot really deal with this kind of phenomenon. On the other hand, just as we do labor market reform when there is full employment and not in other circumstances, there is an imperative to continue to think about the role of enforcement in antitrust and how it plays in these times. So I think it's basically a good time to do antitrust and do it more, because there is no case for doing it less. in situations where the market is the way it is. I don't want to rely on a direct relationship, but there is also no question that I do not see any cause for letting go or letting it slide. Yes, it is true that if one was to enforce and take action that decrease the market power, that would be a one-off. Hence to be a one-off intervention because you do something on a particular case in a particular industry, and that decreases the market power. And it isn't just something that goes into lowering the level of prices generally. But of course, the frequency is not right of this intervention to deal with inflation, but it is still a benign and beneficial form of intervention. So to conclude, I think when we are thinking about the particular actions that I think antitrust agencies need to keep pushing, I would single out two in particular. I think, to my mind, serious enforcement against anti-competitive mergers has to remain a priority. And although that may seem counterintuitive, we, I think, have observed that in-market consolidation in sectors with high barriers to entry is not particularly benign in situations of crisis, because we've seen the supply chain disruption, we've seen the loss of resilience, we have concentrated market in ways that have contributed to that, in my view. And although I accept there is no systematic study that I know of this relationship between, over time, gradual consolidation in sectors, my own experience of having been at the coal face for so many years is that we've witnessed the gradual consolidation, increasing concentration in multiple sectors. And don't talk about digital, I'm talking about chemical, agrochemical, pharma, other sectors. And it seems to me hard to dispute that this increasing concentration makes it harder to preserve resilience or is a contributing factor to disruptions in times of crisis. So merger control has got to be a major focus and remains so. And the other thing is, of course, the fight against cartel illegal competitive agreements, because even though this kind of environment is not necessarily in itself a form of collusion, it's not the product of collusion, we have also seen, I think, pretty dubious statements on the part of companies in the current climate, pointing to the general price pressure generally out there and suggesting that their price increases were necessary. And that meant that it could be a form of signaling. It could be a form of indication to others that, you know, I'm doing this and I won't. On the other hand, it's true that if there is a supply side bottleneck, right? If I know that I'm General Motors and I know that I can't get this component, I can say I can't expand my output. And so, you know, is that collusion? But I think that there has been considerable concern about some of the signals that were being given. So I think, to conclude, I'll stop here, but I think it'd be unrealistic for antitrust agencies to be major actors in this place. In this space, competition enforcement is a supply side tool. On the other hand, and it is complementary to others, to state the obvious, and it has a part to play. But I do not think that market power is a driver of inflation. That said, we need to continue to abate it because it can contribute to persistently support outcomes that are not desired. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Christina. That was very helpful, very clear. And our next speaker is Jan Eckhout. So if you allow me to introduce him. Jan Eckhout is a research professor at Pompeu Fabra. He's also a professor of economics at University College London. In the past, he's been on the faculty of various universities, including University of Pennsylvania. And I should say, in a happy year for the Stern School of Business. He was a visiting professor at NYU in maybe some 10, 15 years ago. I cannot recall exactly when, but I recall it very well when he was here. And it was a great thing to have him here. He has very wide research interests from macro to micro to labor, even game theory. He's published very widely in leading economic journals. And in 2019 was elected Fellow of the Kinematic Society, which for people who are in this business is a very high distinction indeed. Not only that, but his recent book, The Profit Paradox, brought much of this knowledge in economic theory to the general public and received very extensive media coverage, and rightly so, I should add. On a personal note, I should say that I've always enjoyed talking to Jan and learned a lot from reading his work. And there have also been several emails that I've written with research questions, which he has replied very promptly and very helpfully. So I'm very grateful for that. And I very much look forward to hear what he has to say about the topic of the day, market power and inflation. Jan.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for the organizers also for setting up this wonderful panel and for inviting me to participate. Luis, it was in 2006, 2007, so it's just a couple of years ago. So wow. So the great thing about being on this panel is that, you know, not only do I agree with Christina, I agree to agree with her. And so I might repeat some of the things that she's touched on. I'll try to give it a little bit of a different angle, but you know, I fully agree with what she's been putting forward. What I'd like to do is, as Christina indicated, is basically talk a little bit about, first of all, kind of the basics of inflation as opposed to measures of market power, which could be markups or profits. And as Christina pointed out, inflation is about levels. And whatever we measure in terms of market power, whether that is profits, whether that's markups, whether that's, and then I mean, by the way, profit rates, typically we look at, whether it's something about, you know, market valuation relative to sales, these are all ratios. And so it's trying to basically make a connection between something that tells you something about, you know, the price indirectly. A markup is directly the price and the marginal cost, but the profits takes into account all kinds of costs. And so it's relating price to cost. And that's important for looking at the evolution, because think of something like semiconductors. Because of Moore's law, roughly prices double every year, I believe it is. So sorry, not the prices, I meant the number of connections on a certain area on a transistor. And so basically this is giving you an enormous increase in productivity. This unit becomes of higher and higher quality. Now, if you look at the price per unit of quality, that is the number of connections that you have, that price is falling like crazy. Because, you know, per unit of connection, you can produce the same output with much lower cost and much more efficiently. But that doesn't say anything about necessarily whether there's market power, because the efficiency could be increasing so fast so that the cost is dropping very fast. And as a result, the price might fall, that might fall at a slower rate, and then you can still have market power even though prices fall. And this is, I think, very important to keep in mind in the debate about, you know, inflation on the one hand and say markups or measures of market power on the other hand. The second thing, which I think is key in distinguishing issues of market power from issues that are strictly related to inflation, which is the fact that market power is a really, really slow process. And I mean, you know, firms might get lucky and make a breakthrough. If you look at Pfizer's valuations gone up a lot because of the COVID vaccine that they had bought from BioNTech, or BioNTech's valuation itself shot up very quickly. And you could say sometimes innovations happen fast, but most of the time this takes long periods of innovation, of spending money and making investments in R&D. And if you look at inflation is something that happens really much faster. I always make the comparison between, you know, market power being more like an oil tank, whereas inflation is like a jumpy zodiac. I mean, these are very different objects. And this has important implications also to understand, or kind of gives us an insight in understanding what really is going on when we see these very fast changes. It's unlikely that we see a very fast change in market power. Some exceptions, as I gave of BioNTech, whose valuation jumped up enormously because of their disinfection, but most of the time this is something that is moving very slowly. One of the facts, I'm going to go back to more facts, but one of the facts that we find is that measures of market tell us that there's been a rise in this amount of market power, and what this really has done is what we've seen it over the last 40 years roughly. We see that this measure has gone up by some 1% per year, and most people think that this is enormous. This is of enormous magnitude. Now, if you compare that to what happens with inflation, we see 9, 10, 11% of inflation within 1 year. So we're talking about completely different magnitudes, and to really see a change in the extent of market power of say 10% would mean that we would need more than a decade of market power recompressed within 1 year. And that should have all have happened in the last few years, and that's very unlikely that that will be the case. So, one, levels versus ratios; two, the time horizon, the speed, whether this is a slow process for market power, a fast process for indicators of inflation; and three, the magnitudes are just being so different. I think already indicate that these are very different objects. Now, of course, it all is about the price. It's all about the same price. We only see products sold at one price. I mean, we can't say, oh, let me now say, this is the price that informs me about inflation and a different price that informs me about market power. It's the same unit. But there is also one important agent that is so far, at least in what I've talked about, left out, which is the central bank. Because if you have a central bank that is credible in the sense that it has a mandate to keep inflation at 2%, and does what it needs to do in order to achieve it, maybe with more or less success, but it tries to achieve it, then in the very long run, and here the long run shouldn't be that long because anticipation is that this inflation will be under control in the next 1 or 2 years, at least in that time horizon, we would expect that the central bank will have adjusted policy in order to get back an inflation of 2%. What is it saying? It's basically saying that inflation is a purely monetary nominal issue, whereas markups and market power is something about the real economy. Now, of course, economists are also debating whether inflation is really truly only something nominal, because there's all kinds of frictions, and one of the issues is how fast firms can or do they adjust prices, which is a key aspect of how fast inflation goes down. There's expectations of individuals which affect inflation, which basically, although expectations are not real, they become real through the actions of the individuals. And it may be that the Fed or the ECB in Europe get it wrong. They use the Taylor rule as kind of their basic modus operandi, and it may not be the right way to address this. So if we take together these issues that, there's huge differences in terms of what happens when we talk about, say, what inflation is versus a market or an indicator of market power, together with the fact that the central bank will eventually achieve that there will be inflation control at a level of around 2%, which is their mandate, then it already gives an indication that these are different things to consider. Now, a second aspect, which I think is closely related, is I'm going to call this under a very kind of maybe populist term, but which is corporate greed. You see a lot in the press, and maybe kind of in discussions by people talking about this. They say, well, but there is corporate greed, and I think that is true. I mean, firms will increase prices when they can. As Adam Smith said, on the one hand, you can, as an individual or as a firm, behave selfishly, but it only is going to work and lead to the best outcome for everyone if there's enough competition. And so whenever they can increase prices, they will. But competition is not always the same as having market power. And I don't really want to make this very kind of this play on words, but you can have many competitive markets where you can actually raise the prices. Let me give you the example of the face masks in March 2020. So there was, of course, for obvious reasons, an enormous rise in the demand for surgical face masks. And what happened was that we saw the price go from around, say, 3 or 4 cents a mask to €1.50 or $1.50 roughly. You see this enormous jump, and for obvious reasons. Basically, supply was much smaller than demand. And because of this excess demand, there was basically no market clearing except at a price that was substantially higher. Now, what has happened in this competitive market, because the face mask, surgical face mask market is I think, close to competitive. Of course, you still need some scale, but it's not the type of scale that we need in order to create enormous market power. What happened is that a lot of people in that area, in that sector, invested in machinery and started to produce face masks. I know the case of a person here who produces material textiles for hospitals. He didn't produce face masks, but he saw what happened and immediately started buying machines, where he could get them, made enormous investment, 900,000 euros. And within a month, he was producing face masks, selling them at €50, but that lasted for about 1 or 2 months. By July, August, the price of the face mask was back to its competitive price from before. Now, what you've seen in this case is that you could say, well, this is a form of corporate greed because there was a reaction to this lack of supply by charging higher prices, but there was also a reaction to this lack of supply by entry. And there was a lot of new firms entering, and this basically led to a new equilibrium transition from high prices back to the more competitive price of a few cents per mask. And I think this is important to keep in mind because firms that can raise the price will raise it, whether they're in a competitive market or in a not so competitive market. And one of the things we do see is that there is, of course, prices that are going up way above the marginal cost, both in markets that are competitive and that are not competitive. And one of the things we see in the data is since the pandemic and basically since the supply chain distortions is that we have seen that market power measures of such as markups have gone up in this period after the pandemic or during the pandemic. But we've also seen that these prices have gone up in competitive markets. And I guess the issue is, can we tease out what has happened in competitive markets and what has happened in markets where there's more lack of competition or more market power? And my reading of the data is that it's going on everywhere. And so if we see CEOs discussing on their calls, let's raise prices just because we can, well, that has happened in markets with market power. It also has happened in markets with competition. And to that extent, the reality is more Schumpeterian, I think, with kind of temporary monopoly positions. The question is, what happens to these other firms that have much more permanent rather than transitory monopoly positions, which are basically the ones that have given rise to this market. Now, I already said, there's been a rise in the markups that we see over this period. And the other thing that is an indication that there is a kind of a goal that prices have increased the profits is one, that profits have gone up, but also that the price inflation is higher than the wage inflation. And ultimately, a large chunk of what firms face as cost is going to go into wages. And since the prices for output have gone up more than the prices for the wages, that's really what's driving this increasing wage and this price in profits. But as I said, this happens both for firms with market power and with the ones without market power. And the difference really is how permanent is it. The firms that do not have market power really will have a much shorter-lived increase in these margins, whereas the firms with market power might have it for a long time. Before I finish, and I think the next time we will go into more detail in some of these issues, I want to say one thing about natural resources, which is, natural resources is one of the reasons why, as Christina was referring to, this perfect storm, why we see this rise in cost and therefore in prices. Now, this leads to windfall profits for some firms, and this is part of the problem. Households can't get enough heating in the winter. They're struggling to make ends meet because these prices for them are very important. And this is, by the way, one of the important things that we see, that the inflation is definitely not something that is uniformly distributed. If you look at food, energy, that is really affecting the poor disproportionately more than the rich, whereas maybe the rich have a little bit more of a kick from transportation and hospitality, but that's only slightly more. Really, the majority of the cost of inflation is borne by poor people, if you look at the different sectors where this is. Now, energy being a natural resource, and since this is a discussion about the relation between kind of rising prices and competition policy, I think here the key issue is regulation. My favorite ways is comparing, say Russia to Norway. If you start from most resource markets, they're in a global market, they're fairly competitive. The price of oil is set fairly competitive. The price of gas, there's maybe a bit of less competition because there's transportation and pipelines and that are, these frictions create the potential for market power. But overall, these prices are globally determined. So this is not, whether or not there are windfall profits in some firms is not whether the market is competitive. It's very often because these markets are not regulated. And you see the differences I was going to say between Russia and Norway. I think Norway has done a wonderful job regulating their resource markets, whereas Russia, of course, in the 90s, they basically gave the keys to a few oligarchs, the keys to mines and natural resources, whereas Norway really has been able to channel many of these valuable natural resources into basically the vision sovereign wealth fund. And this is basically a way to, at the same time, raise taxes, to do basically a lot of social policy and infrastructure investment. Now, the issue is Norway doesn't have to bother at this point about windfall taxes because these taxes are automatically being reverted to the Norwegian wealth fund. Maybe Norway says now, well, the price of energy is too high for our families, so maybe we want to subsidize it. They can do it because they have the resources. You can't do that in countries where none of these natural resource markets are regulated in that way. And the reason why I point this out is because we talk a lot about antitrust and dominant positions of firms, which eventually many of these unregulated firms have in the resource markets and the energy sector. But this is so much about ex-ante regulation, much more so than it is about antitrust, about enforcement of competitive markets, because these markets can be fairly competitive. The only difference is that the ownership structure is in such a way that really individuals of an inelastically supplied good get all the return, which is something that really should be held as in Norway in a sovereign wealth fund rather than in an individual firms or individual persons. So natural resources kind of have a very different aspect to it, I believe, than which are a big driver, by the way, of inflation at the moment, than say the lack of competition because there's been too lax enforcement of mergers and things like that. I'm going to leave it here and we'll come back to some of these issues in a bit. Thanks, Luis.
Thank you, Jan. So I understand you still have more to say, and I look forward to the second part of your second set of remarks. But before then, let me introduce you our third panelist, Klaus Massuch. He's the principal advisor and the director of general economics of the European Central Bank. His previous assignments were as head of the Monetary Policy Strategy Division and EU countries division, both at the ECB. Now, if I were to make an analogy between economic policy and military, I would say that Klaus has extensive combat duty experience, if you will. So let me explain. In 2010, he was asked to head the ECB delegation involved in the negotiations with the Greek government, no less than the Greek government, in the conditions underlying the famous financial package that the EU and IMF provided during the financial crisis. And he continued doing so until 2015. So respect. There's a combat duty experience in here. Now, on a more serious, and I was going to sound on a more serious note, but I was being pretty serious about it. But Dr. Klaus Massuch also holds a PhD in economics from the University of Würzburg. And Klaus, I understand you will be sharing a slide presentation with us, and Klaus' remarks from the perspective of a central banker, I think, will provide a very nice complement to Christina's and Jan's, which were somewhat more focused on the perspective of competition policy. So Klaus, the floor is yours. If you want to share your screen and show your slides, we're eager to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Louis. I'm just about to share my slides. You let me know whether you can well hear me and whether you can see the slides already.
We can see the slides and we can hear you.
Okay, very well. I would like to thank the organizers, and in particular Ms. Matos Rosa and everybody else who has wonderfully prepared this workshop. And it's an honor for me to speak here. And certainly I'm speaking in my own capacity. What I'm saying in this discussion or presentation is my own views, my own opinions, not necessarily those of the ECB.
If I may interrupt you just a second, we do see your slides, but we see, I don't think it's in full screen. Maybe it's just me, but at least I don't think we're seeing it in full screen.
Well,
anyway, we can see it anyway.
Yeah, let me see. Now I see it on both sides of the screen. Let me see whether I can. So what
it comes with the notes.
No notes. It comes with no. There are no notes. But this is first the second slide.
We are seeing the thumbnails and the notes. That's all.
That is. How do I do that? Perhaps I don't want to. Wait a minute. I try to share.
It's not a major problem if you don't see how to do it.
Is better now?
Yeah, it's good. You got it.
Okay, sorry for this short interruption. Yes, I must say what I heard from Christina and Jan, I can support certainly the current high inflation in almost everywhere in the whole world, in all advanced economies. I mean, certainly this is not primarily driven by any, say, change, worsening of competition or higher market power. Certainly, this as well explained by Christina and Jan. These are two different issues. Having said this, I'm going too fast. Having said this, I would like to introduce a bit how when we in the central bank, we are not looking at the implementation of competition laws and antitrust laws in detail a lot. We are looking more from a broader perspective of general policies which can help to improve competitiveness, competition, reduce market power, but also improve potential output. So I'm going to speak a bit more about these general policies, but I make a clear link to competition when going through. And I had a look at the paper by Jan on the book by Thomas, and I must say it's a very nice, very well written review. And from this I took that what can cause weak competition, what can cause increasing market power. There are effectively 3 or 4 major causes. The first is technological process. Winner takes it all. Superstar firms, very productive firms get a bigger market share and grow, and we know all the key examples of Amazon or Google and so on, and after Facebook, and after some time they have a lot of market power. But there's an advantage for the broader economy that these firms are growing because they're more productive. So on average, output increases. Now the concern is that once these firms have increased market power, they may also start to increase prices or markups relative to the marginal costs. And then when they do so, of course, not all the advantages of increased aggregate productivity will end up with consumers. Some will end up with the firms or the firm owners. But in general, this reason for more market power is at least starting from a positive development, because you have the good, effective, productive firms growing faster and thereby being able to supply more goods to all the consumers. But then there are, even the more problematic, I would say, the reasons for high market power is that we have excessive or misguided regulation, and regulation that hinders the entry or the growth of smaller new firms, startups to compete with existing firms. That, of course, is if such regulations are introduced, this, of course, is clearly detrimental because there's no productivity gain. It's just that old incumbent firms are protected, and the competition, which would be more productive possibly and lowering prices, is not able to enter the market. And there's another issue, especially Christina spoke a lot about, of course, competition and antitrust laws as effectively as implementing these laws. No, certainly, if these laws and rules are not implemented forcefully, if competition authorities allow big mergers or whatever, then of course this is another, say, negative impact, has a negative impact on competition, and it would, of course, increase market power. And here I have a question when I was listening to the first two panelists. What happened with the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine? At some point, one may have to discuss whether all the supplies which you get from one big country, say like Russia, an autocratic or a country, whether from a competition perspective, this should not seen as one big firm, because in a kind of extreme situation, as we have seen, all the firms from Russia will act as dictated by the regime, as dictated by Putin. And so if a country like my own country, Germany, is very dependent on Russian gas and oil, that of course is something where you could say that ex ante, the degree of competition perhaps was not such that our supplies were sufficiently diversified. But of course, this is an ex post view, and the question is, what can one do ex ante? Just mentioning this, that what we're seeing in the last year is a bit also an issue of, say, looking at competition from an international perspective and also from a geopolitical perspective. Now, what I also saw in the paper by Jan, which I quoted, is, and I found that very interesting, that there's a possibility of a vicious circle, that firms which have become bigger, possibly for good reasons, possibly for the first reason I mentioned above, the technological progress, they may then exert political power or technological power, say political power by lobbying parliament members or government members, and they may achieve that one of the two bad things mentioned under 2 and 3 above are implemented. So they get new laws which protect their market share, or which avoid competition and entry, or they may have possibilities to use the technology to exclude other competitors. And there, of course, one way of regulation to counteract it is to ensure interoperability, which there are some good examples for this in the EU, as Sian has mentioned in the paper. Now, I would mainly focus here in this slide on the lower part and to broaden the issue. I mean, the main focus I think from a policy perspective and a broader perspective, which the central bank has, is which structural policies and regulations can enhance competition, flexibility, and in particular limit and control market power, rent seeking, collective moral hazard, bailout, lobbying for protection, or corruption. Now, this is much wider than the narrow and very important focus on competition laws and antitrust laws. But I think many of these policies which can intervene and reduce rent seeking, which can avoid moral hazard, collective moral hazard, these are also helping to improve competition in the market. You may know that, I think, quite good paper by Fari Tirol, I think written 2013, which was called Collective Moral Hazard and Bank Bailout, where they nicely show that all the banks are doing the same, maturity mismatch, relying on short-term funding and high leverage and high investment in longer-term, less liquid assets, because all the banks know if a financial crisis comes, they are together very systemic, and so they will be bailed out ex post by the taxpayer without having had to pay any ex ante insurance fee to the government for this bailout protection or for this insurance. So, and I think that is the general issue which of course, is more implicit and less easy to detect, but we should be very, the governments and competition authorities should think and look into these issues where many firms, there may be many banks, maybe many firms in one sector go all in the same direction. The example I had, all the energy firms in Germany went in the direction, not all of them, but many to become increasingly reliant on Russia because they knew if we all do the same and something happens, we get bailed out. And this bailout is, of course, something, this ex-post bailout for which they did not have to pay any ex-ante insurance premium is, of course, squarely falling on the taxpayer and on the less rich people in the society. So this also makes the inequality, which anyhow is increasing due to the adverse energy shocks, food price shocks, even worse. Now, that is the question, what could competition policy do to avoid that many firms, there may be many, there may be competition, but they all go in a risk management direction, in the same direction, knowing that if something goes wrong, they get an ex-post bailout from the state and the taxpayer for which they do not have to pay ex-ante any proper insurance premium. That is certainly undermining competition and increasing market power, but in a very subtle manner, in a manner which is only visible once the adverse shock happens. In this case, the adverse shock was that Russia, without any reason, was aggressively starting a war against Ukraine. Now I come to some remarks on the link to inflation, and I think here Christina and Jan have said most of the important things, but I would say that in this nice paper the organizers distributed, we have it here quoted up there, more competition in product market leads to lower prices, downward pressure on profit margins, and this can reduce prices and contribute to the same inflation. This is certainly the case. I have said already, the current high inflation is not due to, say, more market power or so, but still, when I look back in a few years, I'm quoting, sorry, I'm jumping to the slide before. Here I quote a paper in which I was involved, which we did with the Monetary Policy Committee of the Eurosystem 4 years ago on structural policies. And when we had this paper in 2018, there was a lot of concern that more reforms, more competition policy would push down prices and inflation even further. We did not think this was a strong argument against competition policies or structural reforms, but nevertheless, it was in the academic debate, in the political debate, an argument why these reforms, these policies were possibly less important 4 or 5 years ago. Now we have the opposite. Now we have, these policies are always important from a welfare perspective, as nicely mentioned by Christina and Jan. But now we have the additional reason that if more competition, if policies which reduce market power can be implemented, that this also help a bit on the margin to reduce inflation. And this is very important. They help to reduce, say, bad inflation in the sense that it is normally increasing inequality. We have a bad supply shock, energy prices going up. And this, of course, is something, if the relative prices of import goods are going up for commodities, for energy, where a country like Euro area countries, EU countries get poorer. We get poorer. And there's unfortunately nothing monetary policy can do about it, about the fact that higher relative energy prices will make us all poorer in terms of real incomes, in terms of real profits, and so on. Monetary policy cannot change it. Monetary policy can ensure that inflation comes down smoothly to the target, but the welfare losses from terms of trade, adverse terms of trade shock, energy price shock, cannot be addressed by monetary policy. The distribution implication can be addressed by fiscal policy. Now, this is similar from a situation where you have say, policies which allow for rent seeking, or policies which allow for more market power because they protect incumbent firms. But these kind of policies will, on general, also be lead, or lack of good policies will lead to an unfair distribution of income. They will normally help people owners of firms who are already relatively rich, and it will allow these firms to extract more rents from the taxpayer, or to extract, as I've mentioned before, or to extract more rents from the consumer, who is on average less wealthy or less rich. So that is another issue which is, I think, important. Now, Louis, how many minutes I would have roughly?
You've been on for almost 15 minutes now, so a few more minutes.
I will show you a few slides and then I will stop. No, this is something I think Jan will like. This is a slide where we show for the last 50 years the labor share on the left-hand side, US, the light blue, and Europe, the dark blue, and it's amazing fall in the labor share in Europe relative to the US. And then you have on the right-hand side, you see the reverse picture, which is the profit margin. The profit margin in Europe had been in the 70s around 20-25, and it increased to 35, almost 35 within 2 decades. Whereas in the US, it was fluctuating around 35 and is now going up to 40. And you see on the left-hand side that this decline in the labor share is matched, broadly speaking, by a decline in the trade union density. How many workers are engaged in trade unions? So this is certainly something where the topic of monopsony, of market power, of firms over, say, wages over workers is relevant. And I show you this second slide, which is looking into the last 23 or 4 years for the euro area as a whole. And on the left-hand side, you see yellow, the productivity per employee, and you see blue, the real compensation per employee, here deflated by the HSCP, consumer price. And you see that in the long run, these two variables increase hand in hand. In the first, say, broadly in line, in the first 7, 8 years, 6 years of monetary union, the increase of productivity was faster than the increase of real wages. So there was some gain in terms of profit share. This is another perspective on this situation. And now I show you some framework conditions which are quite different. And framework conditions in the broad sense have to do with competition, with flexibility. You see here countries like Finland, Luxembourg, Netherlands doing quite well in these framework conditions. They include World Bank governance indicators, regulatory quality, government effectiveness, absence of corruption, and so on. And you see some other countries with relatively weaker framework conditions. And I can show here on the right-hand side product market, say competition, product market, flexibility, very similar. Luxembourg, US, Finland, Ireland, quite high on Belgium, Estonia, and some other countries on the right-hand side, quite different. And here I wanted to just show you, and then here I will end, the same chart which I showed before for the euro area as a whole. I show here for France and left side and Italy on the right-hand side. And this, I think, when I saw this chart in the last days, I wasn't aware, but I found it quite interesting and quite telling. You see, the yellow line, the productivity per worker in France, 100 is 2019 Q4 before COVID. So roughly from 85 to 100, a trend increase in the yellow line, the productivity per worker in France. And the blue line is broadly in line with that. So the real wages per worker have increased roughly the same. They were stagnating since 2017, while productivity was still increasing. But all in all, a nice upward move in both productivity and real wages. And France, in this indicator I have shown you before, product market, not labor market, but product market and framework conditions, is significantly better than Italy. And you see here what happened in Italy, which is clearly showing you that the situation is different. You see that the yellow line was say stagnating for 5-6 years until the financial crisis, and then during the financial crisis and again the sovereign debt crisis, it was going down quite a lot, the productivity per worker, and the real wage some delay followed. I mean, the real wage effectively was collapsing in 2011-12 during the sovereign debt crisis back to the level where the productivity was falling. So you see that without productivity increases, what these two pictures tell you is not a proof, but it's very kind of intuitively clear. Without trend productivity increases, we will also not have trend real wage increases. And you see that even within the euro area, with very similar kind of the same monetary policy, the same currency, and so on, two large countries here, France and Italy, can have quite different developments. I'm not saying that all of these differences are due to framework conditions, competition, or regulation, but certainly there is some element in explaining this. I'm not showing this here, and this is my conclusion. The last point I would like to put emphasis on again is that a major contribution for a more efficiency, sustainable growth should come from policies and regulations that enhance competition. And it is so important to understand that such policies, to the extent they limit market power, they limit rent seeking, they limit collective moral hazard, they limit the lobbying for protection and corruption, they will improve on inequality, they will avoid unfair inequality. And that is more important than ever in a situation where the two main crises which we were facing in last years, the pandemic and the Russian war against Ukraine and its dire consequences, have not only reduced the welfare and the real wealth or real income of our societies in Europe as a whole, but have also been distributed more negatively. More of the burden has fallen on low income and middle income people. And therefore, such improved competition policy is now even more important than it normally anyhow is. Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus. Thanks for that, also for some of the data that you shared with us. So what I'd like to propose now is that we have a second round of remarks. I suppose that, Jan, you may want to react to some of what Klaus had to say, but I know that you also had some additional points that you wanted to share with us in terms of market power and inflation. I would just ask that this second round of reports will be a little shorter because we have about 15 minutes to go or so. So Jan, if you want to take the floor.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, I mean, I think that many of the points that Klaus has made, I would like to echo them. I think one of the things that comes out, which is related to some of the things that Klaus has said, which are related to inequality, and I think that when we want to think more clearly about understanding what's going on, is that we see one thing that's very much in common between the impact of inflation and the impact of market power, is that there's a lot of heterogeneity across different types of people. And so in inflation, we see it that the inflation affects, poor people through housing and through food and energy disproportionately more. And I think that's kind of the thing I would like to pick up that Klaus was bringing up in his last slide. When we see, how we understand these mechanisms, if I look at models of inflation, there's a big push and still a lot to be understood what these heterogeneous effects are really doing in the economy, because the standard kind of model is still very much about a representative agent, representative firm. And we know that that's where a lot of the differences and really the welfare effects are coming from. And if I think about what people are talking about now in this literature on inflation, I think, well, if you have these supply distortions, maybe having the type of monetary policy that we have today is not necessarily the right one, because we want to target very different parts of the economy. You want to target, for example, energy, as opposed to across the board what is currently being done. And I think it's very similar also in trying to understand what competition policy does. I mean, competition policy is per definition going really after very different types of firms. I mean, it's not something that's across the board. And I think in inflation policy, I think we can learn a lot about what's going on. Now, going to understanding, and again, really the relationship between inflation and what the effect is of, say, the dominant position of firms. Christina hinted at this before. I mean, there's this really big elephant in the room, which is this incomplete pass-through. I mean, it tends to go in the opposite direction. If we really want to understand what is driving inflation, what is driving is market power driving inflation, all the evidence that I know of says the more market power, the less pass-through there is. That means that the less effect there is on prices from any shock, whether it's a supply shock or whether it has to do with an increase in the dominant position of a firm. We would expect to see less of an effect on prices than if this market is competitive. And so I think that's a very important one. One that people don't talk much about it, but there's quite a bit of research also showing that, people's behavior changes when there is, say, high inflation or when there is a recession. So people shop differently, and this tends to lower markups. So it's actually going in the opposite direction. So one of the things that people have seen in the behavior of individuals is that when shoppers are in a recession, they really shop more carefully and they actually get more bargains, and therefore the price markup is lower. And I think what economic theory tells us is that a lot of that link between inflation on the one hand and market power is actually quite tenuous. Is it there? I mean, there may be other things that are going on. I mean, I talked earlier about the fact that firms raise prices when they can, and there may be as many supply chain distortions in competitive markets as there in markets with market power, and then we would still see some of these kind of effects. And that's why also we see that the margins have increased across the board. I want to say one last thing about the labor market and the effect on wages in terms of thinking about what do we know in economics. One thing, and I thought it was very interesting that Klaus was linking the effect of unions. But one thing that we know is that in the long run, especially over that period that you showed, I think it was over 4 decades, what you would expect is that if there is entry of firms, if there is competition in these markets, then sure you get a redistribution of the surplus. But now the profits of the firms go up, you should see entry of new firms. And if union bargaining is weakened, you should see actually the result of that should be more entry of firms, because you basically have a higher surplus. And we haven't seen that, right? Because and this says that sure, there's been a change in the bargaining position that has one effect, and that's there, and I completely agree with that. But there must be something else too, because otherwise we wouldn't have seen that rise in profits, especially in the long run. I mean, if you tell me for whatever reason a new legislation, reduces the union coverage, and then immediately you don't see that entry, but over 4 decades, you would expect that we would see that. And I think this is kind of an interesting aspect of the labor market. I fully agree that union coverage has an impact on the distribution of, say, wages versus profits, but there is also something that has entry that is there. And I think that's something that we see in the labor market. The same thing with monopoly power. There's a lot of talk about monopoly power. We see that monopoly power is there, but we haven't, at least the estimates that I've seen and the work that I've done, is we don't see much of an increase in the extent of the monopoly power. It's there, it's important, it's sizable. In fact, it's around 30% of marginal productivity of labor, but it isn't increasing all that much. In fact, it's fairly constant over the last 4 decades. And again, that's an interesting explanation in terms of understanding what happens to the labor share that Klaus, you were putting up. It's interesting to see what's going on there, but at least the evidence that I know of, this is not coming from a rise in monopoly power to that extent. So maybe we can have the discussion on this or other topics. I'll just give the floor back to Luis.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks for that. Klaus, any reaction to that, or any further remarks you might have on?
Yeah, no, thank you, Jan. No, I agree. No, what a falling labor share can be due to market power or increasing market power, but you certainly are right that the decline in union power can contribute. but we have not seen, as you're saying, more entries. Take kind of entry firm trying to grasp the profit margins which are there. And then the question, of course, is why do we not see more entries into the markets? And at least one reason could be, but you have certainly better placed down than me. That could be that, I mean, we have, at least when I look at Europe or Germany, we have in the last decades more and more regulation which make it more and more difficult for firms to set up and invest and kind of buy a piece of land and buy and build a factory there or build something there. I mean, there are so many regulations, licensing issues, and so on, that it's, I mean, look at wind power parks in Germany. I know that a bit. They have the capacity installed in addition to the already existing capacity has fallen since 2016 dramatically after Russia invaded the Ukraine the first time in 2014 and went to Syria with this brutal war. We should have known that we need more energies. That there was a substantial decline in what was allowed to add to wind energy in Germany, and many people say there is so much regulation, there is so much possibility of local communities to hinder these investments. So there is something which is a bit outside the narrow competition field, that in many areas you would want to see, say, investment in renewable energies, but it's so difficult to enter the market because there are so many stakeholders who can postpone, prevent, have a lawsuit, and so on. And another issue which might be relevant in this thing is, I have heard, but I'm not an expert, from experts saying that what big, say, technology firms with with all this information about consumers and so on, which Facebook and Amazon and Google have, all this information they take out from your activities on the internet and so on, that this information could not be this information could not be so easily be stored in sorry, I had a problem with my computer. This information could not be so easily kind of stored in servers in Europe because we have much more data protection. So data protection certainly is sensible and useful, but what if it just shifts investments from Europe in other countries, and our data is there in the US or in China, and nobody can really control what is there, and the investment in the entry into markets, into such markets in Europe, is possibly made more difficult due to data protection. So these are 2 or 3 examples where I wonder why that certain regulations make market entry more difficult, and then of course they allow existing firms who are in the market to have higher profits. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't know if you have any additional remarks, Jan or Klaus. If not, you know, in my role of coordinator and provocateur, I could try and sort of by means of sort of a wrap up and summary of what we've heard so far, and also trying to provoke some reaction on your side, summarize many of the remarks so far by saying that we don't think market power per se is responsible for high inflation rates. Nevertheless, we appreciate your interest in competition policy because we think it's very important. And while we're at that, perhaps some promising panel topics for future workshops would include competition policy and now I've given you a series of possible topics: competition policy and the increase in market concentration, competition policy and the increase in margins, competition policy and big tech dominance, competition policy and supply chain disruptions, which may be more important and more in the current inflation rate than anything else, competition policy and the demise of unions and labor share, competition policy and war and natural resource disruption, competition policy and inequality. So I'm just going to throw that out there. We don't think that inflation is probably the most important motivator for talking about competition policy, but we think that talking about competition policy is really important in this day and age. Reactions to that, if any?
I mean, on this one, I totally agree on this one again. I mean, I think it's important to talk about it. It's important to think about it, because it's also true that, you know, we don't understand everything. But I agree with you that competition policy is important for a whole kind of list of other things. I mean, your list was very exhaustive, I would say, and a little bit scary too. I mean, I think, you know, in my view, competition policy is a little bit underrated as a tool to, you know, bring about the type of change that people look at normally in, you know, labor market policies, in public finance policies, and things like that. And it looks as if, you know, competition policies is somewhat, you know, different. I mean, maybe too, for obvious reasons, legal reasons, maybe too focused on antitrust and not so much on regulation. You know, because if I see what the DMA now does, it looks like this is just ex-ante regulation in the making, whether it will happen or not. But it seems to be more about, you know, thinking about digital technology and digital technology firms more in the same way that we think about transportation, energy, and communication, rather than say, you know, we think of this as antitrust enforcement to make sure that they behave according to the law. No, it's ex-ante regulation, and it seems to me that you know, that competition policy can achieve a lot of these very kind of important social issues, social and non-social, whatever economic issues that we've listed. So I guess we'll be here for a few more of these instances to discuss this.
Yep. Indeed. Klaus, any final thoughts?
Yeah, very briefly. Thanks a lot. I thought your summary is good, and I also agree with what you said or what Jan just said. When I listened to your competition policy, and I was thinking about a very topical issue. One question which could be researched would be, at what point do we have a problem from a competition policy perspective, or from a competition and diversification of risk perspective, if more and more big harbors in Europe are owned by China, or partly owned by big Chinese firms? At some point they go, taking all these harbors in Greece, in Rotterdam, and now in Hamburg is in the plan. They may have a very, very strong, powerful market power position, which I don't know. I think it's outside the scope of current competition rules and laws, but it may be very relevant in the coming years.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to thank Jan and Klaus and Christina, and I also want to announce that immediately following this panel, we'll have the final remarks from Andreas Mundt, the president of the Bundeskartellamt and the current ICN chair, who will close this ICN workshop. So once again, thanks to the panelists, and we look forward to the closing remarks by Mr. Mundt. Thank you.
Yes, hello everybody. Well, this has been most inspiring, and I have listened with great care to the two panels and the introductory remarks that we have just heard. Luis Cabral has set up a couple of topics in connection with competition, which shows already that competition counts everywhere, and it also shows how high expectations by policymakers are when it comes to what competition can do during these times of crisis and during other times of crisis that we have seen before. Well, many thanks to Margarida Matos Rosa for organizing this workshop. Margarida is most active in the ICN as a steering group member, as the vice chair, as an ICN OECD liaison, having hosted already a hybrid ICN cartel workshop in Lisbon in November 2021. So many thanks, Margarida, for organizing this, and many thanks also to Antonio and the whole team. And many thanks, of course, to the speakers that we had the chance to listen to today. This workshop, in a way, was quite special for the ICN because it is a workshop on a very special topic. We have had 3 ICN statements in the last 20 years. The first one dates back to 2009, which was a statement by the steering group on the financial crisis. A second one was in 2020 on the COVID-19 crisis. And already today in 2022, we have done the third statement by the ICN steering group on the current crisis, which is a multi-causal crisis in the very end. But this shows already that we live in times that are not easy to handle. And it is important in these times, I think, that the ICN speaks out loud and makes itself heard when it is needed. And it is needed in these times to support its members, to explain, and we have heard something about it today, what competition agencies can do. Also important what competition agencies in these current crises cannot do. What we can do is we can inform governments. We can send out a clear message that competition also today should be a priority. Most important maybe that competition should be a component of any response that we give in the field of policy to this crisis. And also a clear message to competition agencies. The rules still apply. And this does not only go to competition agencies, it also goes to the business community. We don't relax. We are not lenient. We might take into account the extraordinary market realities that we see for the time being. But that does not mean that we are lenient. It just means that also competition agencies have understood the markets and have understood the development on these markets. And it shows maybe that competition agencies are ready to give guidance to the business community how to behave under these changed market circumstances. We in Bonn at the Bundeskartellamt, we have allowed for some corporations over the last weeks, which we would probably not have allowed for in normal times. Just to mention the cooperation between sugar producers that we have just allowed. This is a cooperation between sugar producers that is intended to mitigate the effects of a possible gas shortage in the future. The lack of gas would stop the production of sugar, and this is a scenario that has to be avoided during this time, because excessive prices for the base product of sugar would have an effect on the entire value chain. Another example for cooperation that we have allowed for and that was cleared by the Bundeskartellamt in the last weeks was a cooperation for the initial setup of floating LNG terminals in northern Germany. A setup of LNG terminals by only a few companies with very exclusive rights at these terminals for a limited period of time I can only say that also here in normal times, maybe this would have been a no-go, but in order to speed up the setup of these terminals, we have agreed and we have clarified these cooperations. So all this shows we give guidance under very specific circumstances. And again, this does not mean that we are lenient, but this means that we apply competition law adjusted to the competitive landscape and to the very specific economic circumstances that we find. The ICN statement on the current crisis also recognizes the limits of competition and competition policy with regard to inflation, covered by the second panel today. Bringing down inflation is not the task of competition agencies, although policymakers might expect a lot from competition agencies. In these times, inflation and the fight against inflation remains the task of the central banks. But as it is highlighted also in the ICN statement, competition enforcement during this time can maybe make a little bit of a difference. There is a link between inflation and competition law, and it comes into play in highly concentrated markets, because in these markets, it is easier to raise prices. Probably there might be companies with price-setting powers that might make use of this power in times like these, whereas in competitive markets, it is expected that price will be set close to cost. In the absence of competition, effective control of abusive conduct by competent competition agencies is indispensable. We do that in digital markets for a long time, but many years ago, exactly, the Bundeskartellamt has also done some proceedings with regard to high prices and has tried to fight against abusively high prices. We have done cases in the area of gas supply. We have done cases in the area of water supply, and we have done cases in the area of district heating suppliers, where we have taken care for a reimbursement or future price reductions by monopolists in these cases vis-a-vis their clients. It shows abusive prices, and this is what should be clear also to the business community. Abusive prices can be subject to control by competition agencies. Also, this might be a difficult task, as we all know. We receive lots of complaints for the time being in the area of fuel, in the area of wooden pellets, cooking oil, grocery. We take these complaints very serious. But it must be very clear, even if we have had successful price proceedings in the past, we are not a price agency. It is different to intervene in these markets if there are not monopolists that raise the prices, but we act if we have the means to act in these cases. What we have done, and I think this is what we can do in these times as well, we have launched a sector inquiry into refineries and wholesalers in April this year. We examine why crude oil prices and the sale prices of refineries and the prices charged at petrol station have differed lately, an ongoing sector inquiry. So we make use of the tools that we have in order to foster transparency in the market and to make clear to companies that we have a look at them, that we have a look at the price development, and that we try to intervene if that is feasible. I think inflation, climate change, the war, and the consequences of all this will be with us for some time to come. The ICN will deal with the consequences by encouraging ICN members to enforce the law. We will act as ICN by competition advocacy. We will inform governments where necessary, but we must be aware that competition policy and enforcement are not isolated. They are the basis of our market economy. Competition will be key for recovery, and the discussions that we have had today will be helpful to explore and explain for the role of competition in the future. Our statement, the ICN statement, will inform governments and agencies and the business community. The ICN will continue to be a hub for exchange and to be a source for information and support. Many thanks again, Margarida, for your leadership, and many thanks to all involved today as speakers and behind the scenes. Many thanks and goodbye. See you later.
you.